Okay, and here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Forensic Intent. Scott here with Dr. Rachel.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, and thank you for those of you who are about to join us. We really appreciate it a lot. We're really excited about this show today. This is probably going to be the first of probably at least a couple that we do, because the case that we're going to discuss today is very, very extensive. And we were just talking with one of our guests backstage, and he described it as encyclopedic, which it really is. So we're going to be highlighting the case today of missing person Jodi Huisentruit, who went missing in 1995. She was abducted in 1995, and we'll get into that with both Scott and Caroline here in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to introduce them and give you kind of a rundown of their qualifications. Both Scott and Caroline are members of the Find Jodi team, which was developed, I believe, back in 2003, but they can correct me on that if I'm wrong. Scott Fuller himself is the official voice of the Find Jodi podcast, and he has created the podcast from start to finish. So let me start with Caroline here. Caroline is a former crime reporter for WCCO out of Minnesota, and she had a 34-year career with WCCO in the Twin Cities, and then ultimately she moved into KSBY TV in the Santa Barbara area for a few years and became their newsroom manager there. She returned to her roots back in 2015 when she did an investigative series on missing persons and unidentified remains for KSBY. During that part of the investigation, Caroline was able to create the most comprehensive database of missing persons on the Central California coast. And you guys, that's a big accomplishment. She also began working for KARE Channel 11 TV in Minnesota on the Jacob Wetterling case. That also happened in 2015. Caroline has an extensive background of covering cold cases. She's filed numerous reports regarding the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit and the abduction of Jacob Wetterling. She has appeared on, as has the show, the Find Jodi podcast has appeared on both 2020, 48 Hours, Oxygen, also on Oprah. And Caroline graduated with a BS in law enforcement from Metropolitan State University. She has a master's degree in police leadership from the University of St. Thomas, and she also has a private investigation license out of the state of California as well. And finally, Caroline recently, it's been a little bit now, became a Petaluma Police Department volunteer, where she plans to focus on crime prevention education. So that's a rundown on what Caroline brings to the table, you guys, which is a lot. So let me jump over to Scott here. Just one second.
Caroline has done a few things.
Caroline has done a few things. Absolutely. So Scott is currently, previous to this, he was working out of Minnesota. He's now, he just let me know here just a few minutes ago, he's now the broadcast and operations manager of 3 radio stations in the state of Wyoming. Scott has a long career in radio. He spent more than 15 years as head of programming for terrestrial radio stations in Maine, Minnesota, and again now in Wyoming. He began doing podcasting in 2003. And as I mentioned earlier, Scott is the official voice and the founder of the Find Jodi podcast. So we are really happy to have both of them here with us today. And we hope you guys have some questions for them. I'm going to bring them on right now. One second here. And there we go. Caroline and Scott, welcome.
Well, thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for coming on.
I just wanted to update real quick on my bio. I am no longer a police volunteer. I've become very involved with our grandkids. I'm a lunchroom lady on Wednesdays in San Francisco at our granddaughter's school and do a lot of volunteer work there in addition to Find Jodi.
Awesome.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Very, very cool. So one thing I wanted to tell our audience before we let you guys kind of take the reins here and roll with this is, you know, if there's anybody out there today that's watching this show today, or if there's anyone that watches later that thinks that they might even have a tiny piece of information on the Jodi Huisentruit disappearance, please come forward, and we'll explain to you later how you can do that. But it's as simple as going to findjodi.com and following the links. But Caroline and Scott will go through that. But, you know, even if you think it may not be related directly to someone who may be involved in the case, still come forward. I'm a former detective, as you guys know, and I've seen the smallest leads turn into something really big without people really expecting that to happen. So with that, I am going to defer to Caroline and kind of let you talk about how the team came to be and about the investigation.
Thank you so much to Scott and Rachel. Find Jodi was created in 2003 by a reporter named Josh Benson from Minnesota, reporter anchor, and his news director boss, Gary Peterson, who sadly just passed away a little over a year ago. They became involved because they had done a number of series on Jodi, and was called the Huisentruit Files. They created this nonprofit back then, and over the years it's grown. Tara Benson, who is Josh's wife, joined the team. I later joined the team in 2011. J.L. Barrio, a retired Woodbury police officer, joined. And Scott is our most recent person to join the team. It's been 4 or 5 years now, Scott?
I think 2020.
We all come from different backgrounds, but one way or the other, we were attached to Jodi's story. All of us but one are members of the media, and people often ask, why this one case? We consider Jodi part of our extended family. You often see this with police officers when one is injured or killed in the line of duty. Jodi disappeared as she was going to work one morning in June 27th, 1995. We don't know if her job was directly connected to what happened to her because the case has not been solved, but she was doing what so many of us have done over the years, and she never made it to work. So we feel like we need to use our experience, our tools. We're all volunteer. We're on a shoestring operation. We dedicate our time to we know what gets covered. A few years ago, we put up billboards. We know things like that. We know how to get media coverage. We also know how to dig. So we try to use those skills to hopefully get answers and bring Jodi home to Long Prairie, Minnesota, where she grew up.
Very good. Very good. Well, I know you guys have done an extensive amount of work on the case, and you know, the Find Jodi team is one of the reasons that the case is still in the light, in my opinion, and one of the big reasons. So talk a little bit about how the whole situation went down, Caroline, the morning of that morning in June, if you would.
Jodi Huisentruit was a 27-year-old anchor of the morning news at KIMT, the CBS affiliate in Mason City. And she overslept that morning. She got a call about 5 o'clock from her producer at the morning news, Amy Coon, saying, "Jodi, where are you?" And basically, Jodi indicated she had overslept. She'd be right in. She only lived 5 minutes from the station. So she scrambled to get ready, took approximately 30 seconds to go out her door, down the steps to her car 12 feet from her building. As she was trying to get into the car, we believe somebody attacked her from behind. They pushed the mirror at her on the driver's side forward. Her key was found bent on the ground, found later. A number of things were thrown on the ground. She was not reported missing for another 3 hours because no one thought that because Jodi didn't show up for work that something had happened. The assumption was that Jodi had fallen back to sleep or maybe had been stopped for speeding on the way to work. So the show went on. Amy Coon's producer went on and anchored the news at 6 a.m. from 6 a.m. to 7. And then shortly after 7, another coworker came in and Amy asked the person to do a police welfare check to find out, because Jodi had been late occasionally before. She had never missed slots. She'd never had what we call dead air. So police went to the key apartments where Jodi lived, as I said, about 5 minutes away. And her apartment looked fine. There was nothing that seemed out of place other than the toilet seat was up, which could mean something. Maybe she'd had a visitor, but uncertain. But in the parking lot by Jodi's car, her red Mazda Miata, clear signs of a crime and a struggle. So you mentioned the bent key on the ground, the mirror pushed forward, a red heel, earrings, hairspray, and then some marks in the silt nearby, like foot marks, like she'd been dragged up, we believe, probably up toward Kentucky Avenue, the entry to her place. the police knew right away that something terrible had happened. So everybody was called in. The police chief, anybody on call was called to the scene. And it went from there. They began investigating, and maybe Scott can pick it up from there, because it took off to become the biggest woman hunt, if you will, in Iowa history.
But you're doing so well, Caroline. That's why she was on TV for so many years. So yeah, after Jodi went missing, there was a very extensive live person search initially for Jodi, emanating from the key apartments, Winnebago River, which adjacents the apartment complex, specifically the building of the complex that Jodi lived in, was a very intensive part of that search. Eventually, and it didn't take very long, over about a week or 10 days, that the radius of that search had extended out 25 miles in every direction. And search efforts, as they do in these cases, eventually wound down, slowed at first, and then wound down to just volunteers aided by the police. Outside of the apartment complex parking lot itself, there has never been a shred of physical evidence found of Jodi or any of her belongings. So we know for sure that she wasn't there after that morning on June 27th, but where she was taken, how, by whom, is still a mystery.
Very interesting. So I'm going to put up a picture here, you guys. I'm just going to have it on my phone. I'm going to hold it up. This is a picture of the apartment complex where Jodi, let's see if I can get it to focus in. So that's the key apartments. So Scott, if you can kind of just talk about, is the river directly behind the apartment complex there?
What you're looking at there are buildings A and B. Behind the perspective where the photo was taken is building C, which is a smaller building, but that is where on the second floor Jodi lived. So there is a third building to that unit. That is the parking lot where Jodi was taken from, where that photo was taken from. But you can't quite see where her car was parked, and you can't quite see building C in that photo.
Okay.
So it's behind you in that picture.
Her apartment faced the parking lot. She was in a second floor apartment facing the parking lot. And one of the things that Scott discovered a few years ago is she was listed in the phone book, her address, all that information was there. So Jodi was a very visible, potentially very easy target, if you will. You could see her getting ready. We talked to residents who actually watched her some days getting ready for work. You could see the light go out in her apartment, see her go down the stairs to her car. As I said, he found it all was listed right there in the local directory if she were targeted by a stranger or a stalker type.
So her window was actually visible. People could,
Yeah.
when she would be in there, they could see.
Absolutely.
I think was one of the points that you had made. Yeah.
And you could see the lights go out. You'd have enough time
Right.
in position to watch her. One of the really tough things from the case is beyond the fact 3 hours were lost from the time she was probably abducted. We think it was probably 4:20 to 4:30. Police weren't called for 3 hours. So you had a 3-hour window there, no eyewitnesses. Later on, when police canvassed the building, we had some people said that they heard some screams about that time, but nobody called police. No surveillance cameras. We didn't have the digital kind of things we have now. None of the kind of tracking things that we hear about. From what we understand, there was very little forensic evidence. One point years ago, one of the investigators said they found one strand of hair. We don't know if there was a root on it or not. Palm print was found, a partial palm print was found, I believe, on the car, which these are potential sources, particularly nowadays where you can get DNA off the most minimal of things, but very little forensic evidence at the scene, which makes it. I can't think of a tougher case, and I've covered hundreds as a court report. I can't think of a tougher case with less going for it. And I think there's a lot of hope when you hear about familial DNA and all that sort of stuff, but we don't have a lot of those things here. We need somebody to come forward. We need somebody who knows something.
Absolutely. You know, Caroline, you and I have talked about this case off and on through the years. And as you know, I've written some pieces on it, which you helped fact check for me, which I greatly appreciated. And, you know, one of the things that really amazed me is that how close Jodi was to her car from her main apartment door. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, we've retraced our own steps to figure it, because you can still just walk in your building, and it looks pretty much the same as it did almost 30 years ago. But it's about a 30-second walk, go down the stairs, and then just 12 steps from the door to her car. And Scott can, I think, again, describe the parking lot, but whoever was waiting for her had to be in position to watch her come down and obscure himself so she wouldn't see him, and then be able to jump in and attack her. Very almost surgical precision in terms of how this thing took place. And we don't believe it could have been somebody just driving down Kentucky Avenue. The apartment complex is kind of a horseshoe, and you wouldn't have time to just be driving down Kentucky, the main road in front of the building, see her get out and get down there. So somebody had to be in position waiting for Jodi, and also prepared to wait longer than usual. Well, as we said, Jodi had been late sometimes before, but she was about, an hour late that morning. So that person had to wait extra long for her to come down.
Absolutely.
So one of our viewers, Sonia, is asking, because we're still at the apartment right now, what type of neighbors did she have? Do we know anything about the neighbors?
Mostly work, and Scott's interviewed quite a few of them, and I've done some as well, but mostly people who worked. There were some retired people, not many children. I think was there 73 units, something like that, in the totality of the 3 buildings. Her building was the smallest one. Scott, maybe you can take us there a little more. There was a dumpster nearby. There are different places we've speculated potentially that somebody could have had cover as they waited for her to come out the door.
I would answer that by saying all types of neighbors. There were elderly, there were college students. There's a community college that's not far from the apartment complex. All kinds of shifts, shift workers, people who report to work at 10 o'clock at night, people who go to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, all types of neighbors. It was I think it's a pretty good cross section of Mason City itself, minus the absence of some children that you might find in more traditional home settings. But aside from that, there were all types, all kinds of backgrounds. Most are alive today. Some have passed away. It's a typical, fairly large apartment complex cross section, I'd say.
And one of the challenges for us as we've been working on it in recent years is we're trying to go back and talk to everybody we can track down. And so many, I'll Google them and they're deceased, or I find an obituary, and it's so frustrating because including some people who were quoted over the years and others, it's very challenging at this point to be tracking them down.
Well, and that's what happens with older cases, as we all know. I mean, time marches on, and people do move, pass away, whatever the case may be. So, yeah, it's very frustrating, and I think honestly that's why it's more important than ever now. I mean, the time to be silent has passed. I mean, if there's anything out there that someone knows, any thoughts on this case at all, I think it's really important that they reach out, no matter how small, because time is passing quickly. Definitely. I wanted to hold up a picture of Jodi here, just if you can see that. There we go. That was Jodi when she was working on the news desk. For those of you who haven't seen her, she was a very young, very excited to be working in that field journalist, from what I've understood. And so the whole thing is just really tragic. Scott, I did want to ask a question of you. So we've talked about, we haven't really gotten into persons of interest or suspects yet or anything like that, but was there any indication that Jodi may have had a stalker that was following her at all?
Only, I'm not sure you can firmly say this is an indication, but she had some kind of presence of mind to have taken self-defense courses in the year prior to her disappearance. That could be read as she has an acute threat that she is worried about, although try as Caroline and the rest of the team might. We've never found Jodi telling somebody, I am scared for my life of this person, whoever it is. She apparently didn't do that. But she's also a woman in media and in television, and Caroline can speak to this better than me, but I've never talked to, and I've talked to 100 or more women who work in broadcast journalism who have some kind of story, whether it's someone showing up their work or this day and age, social media weirdness or emails. Every woman in TV has that story, and she might have had a few of those that kind of went under the radar in the years before all this happened, where she just felt like she might want to protect herself a little bit. There was also an incident in October of '94 from her apartment complex. She went on recreating outside. I think she was jogging or rollerblading down the street, and she was followed by a truck in some kind of way that made her uncomfortable enough to call the police and report that incident to police. So that was the fall or winter before the summer this happened. But no one's ever been able to tell us, yes, she was scared of this person and that's why she took self-defense classes. But I think that gets overlooked in Jodi's case. She's kind of from what we've learned of her personality, a free spirit, happy-go-lucky. And for her to have this moment of fearing for her personal safety, whatever the cause of that was, where she took at least one self-defense course, I think is notable. She was aware of something.
And
Absolutely.
she told the self-defense instructors that she felt somebody had been following her. And this was just in March, a couple months before she disappeared. She also told a friend, we can't be too careful. She encouraged some of her friends to take course, but at the same time, she didn't want to make a big deal. And I get the balance being in the news myself. As a reporter, I didn't get nearly the kind of attention she had, but as an anchor, they so much encourage you in this work to connect with the viewers and make you feel like you know them, they know you. And I think that can go too far, that sometimes people identify like, oh, this person's talking to me, or they get obsessed. And I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, someone coming up to me at Target and touching my belly, feeling they could do that. And it was a freaky feeling, but then I couldn't be rude because I'm on TV. And Jodi was such a visible person in the Mason City community. She'd been there about a year and a half, had 6 months or so left in her contract. She was clearly ready to move on to a bigger market, but she went to all kinds of events. And we should talk a little bit about the day before. Yes. He was at the Mason City Chamber of Commerce golf tournament, and Jodi was a very athletic young woman. She was a golf champion on the state team, high school team championship twice in high school. She also did basketball and some other sports. And they said that Monday, the day before she disappeared, she went to the golf tournament. She played at the Highland course, which was the overflow course, with a couple of local business people and someone from her station. Most of the game got rained out, so they all just kind of hung out. She went home in the afternoon, from what we understand, changed her clothes. She was probably the only one that looked good coming back because they're all soaked. She came back to the chamber for dinner, hung around for a while, and they did some awards and mingled with people. And at one point, speaking of the safety thing, she did tell, according to 2 people we interviewed who were on her team, she talked about she was going to be changing her number soon. She'd been getting some annoying kind of nasty calls. She didn't make a big deal about it, but it was enough that she said she was going to be changing it. We don't know whatever came out of all that. We had not heard about that till 5 or 6 years ago, and we followed up with police to try to get some contact. Wow. I assume they've checked every phone connection, every call.
I was going to ask, do they still have the phone records?
Well,
is that something they could get?
Said they shared this with police and FBI way back almost 30 years ago, so it wasn't coming to us, brand new. But she went home. She left around 8, and the only thing we know for sure after that is she made a phone call at 8:24 to her good friend Kelly Torgerson in Mississippi. Kelly wasn't home. She talked to her husband. Later on, we talked to the husband, her friend, who said that Jodi didn't seem upset about anything, just was checking with Kelly. And then the next thing that we officially know is that Amy Coons, the producer who called her around 5 when she had not shown up for work. We don't know what happened in between. Maybe Scott can pick up here, but the next morning, a good friend of hers, John Van Sice, who co-hosted a birthday party for Jodi a couple weeks earlier, showed up at the Key Apartments complex with a couple other people. And he said that Jodi had come by his apartment the night before to watch the video they had just obtained of her surprise birthday party. And that immediately got him on police radar. And maybe Scott Snyder can speak to that, but he said it's been quoted different ways, whether I was the last one to see her, last one to see her alive, but he made that statement. Police sent him home to get the video, which he brought down to the station. It's about a 17.5 minute video. Police have expressed skepticism in recent years about whether they believe Jodi actually went over there. There's some time frame issues, but we just don't know. But he has been polygraphed, he's publicly said he passed the polygraph. There have been 2 federal grand juries that looked into him. And he, as recently as 2017, the first one was a couple of years after the abduction. Most recent was 2017. Nothing came out of those grand juries. He was asked the second time to supply palm prints, fingerprints, DNA similar things to what he'd provided before. So I don't know if Scott, you can share your background in forensics, why you would do a second round or something like that. But clearly he has stayed on there, but nobody has ever been charged. No one's ever been arrested. He is adamant he had nothing to do with Jodi, but because of bringing up that incident, I think that got him on the radar pretty quickly.
I think so too, and I think they would have been remiss, not doing it, not looking into it further. I always found that statement that he made very interesting because, and I'm not suggesting that John Van Cise is the person that abducted Jodi, but statements like that, I was the last person to see her alive, things like that, does bring up the question of, well, first of all, how do you know that? I mean, how do you know that you were the last one to see her alive? So that statement always kind of bothered me a little bit. But, again, as you guys said, he went through, he passed his polygraphs, and nothing ever came of the grand jury stuff. And it's my understanding now that he's living in the southwestern part of the United States. And do you know, are they still looking at him as a potential person of interest or not?
They share very little information.
Yeah.
Probably shared more information in the early years. The only thing officially we know is what happened in 2017 when they both convened a grand jury. And that same month, in March of 2017, they put some GPS trackers on his cars, two vehicles that he has a connection with. They weren't around at the time Jodi disappeared. So there's been some supposition that they did that, maybe thinking he's coming back to Iowa to provide the forensics that they the DNA, and they were waiting to see if he went somewhere like a burial ground. But nothing ever came out of it. And as I said, we've never seen any evidence that links him. And even the verbiage, we don't know for sure what his actual words were. Was I was the last one to see her? Or did he say alive? Things get repeated over the years. And so we feel it's important to be very cautious about saying what did he actually say that day.
Exactly. Yeah, no, totally understandable. Scott, I wanted to run this past you, and as Caroline just said, you guys have to be very careful on what you say with this. I understand that, and the case is still technically open. Have there been, if you care to comment on this, other persons of interest that have come into the picture over the last few years, or no?
There have been some that have been named in either being ruled out or commented on by MCPD. Thomas Corskadden was one who was a sex offender who lived in southern Minnesota. Tony Jackson is one who Caroline did a lot of work on at WCCO in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Beyond that, I definitely wouldn't want to speculate and introduce any other names. I tend to generally, with cases like this, subscribe to the theory that we sort of fall into a trap of limited options in the public if we're outside of the investigation. We're given, it's like a game of Clue is how we treat it when we're watching these cases from outside. Person A, is it person B, or is it person C? And we oftentimes forget there's a pretty good likelihood that it could be somebody else. It could be none of the above. I think that ultimately does a disservice. There's a reason that police, as you know, Scott, there's a reason investigators look at certain suspects. Most cases don't end up like this. Most cases are pretty simple. And it's usually somebody in that core, circle of trust that the victim has. This could be that kind of a case, but I do think MCPD did some things very wrong initially in this investigation. And I also think sometimes they don't get enough credit for a lack of an answer. There are those rare 1 in 1,000 cases where something crazy happens and it ends up being this perpetrator out of left field that nobody would have thought of. And Jodi, as a victim in her victimology, presents that problem for us because she was on television and because she was in the phone book. So it could be anybody in the media market who, as Caroline indicated, you're building this connection with the audience for your paycheck. That's your job. And that can be construed, that connection through the screen, by a twisted mind in different ways. So Jodi's victimology, just by her profession, makes this case pretty difficult.
Yeah, definitely. So Caroline, I don't want to get too far off of Jodi, but I also wanted to, Scott just brought up a point that, it could be somebody completely out of the picture. You investigated the Jacob Wetterling situation. Mm-hmm. That was somebody completely off the radar. Am I correct on that?
Yes, Jacob. Well, he was on the radar of one of many people early on, but police were focused for many, many years on a neighbor of the Wetterlings. Jacob Wetterling lived in rural St. Joseph, Minnesota. He was abducted in 1989. And I stood at the end of the driveway when police went for like the third search, digging up the property of a local school teacher. And I thought, they must have a lot of stuff to get enough probable cause to convince a judge to keep letting them go back and go after this guy. And in the end, he was totally innocent. He had nothing to do with it. And his life was forever changed. I remember interviewing him after police came across the ultimate person who took Jacob. And it's horrible. I mean, he had that cloud, and he like Van Cise, they both cooperated with police. They both talked, and there were things, his own words were used against him later. I think he made a statement once about his farm property. Oh, there are any number of places you could hide a body here. Well, that's not probably the best thing to say when someone's been kidnapped at the end of your driveway, but I think he was being open and cooperating. And it was really a shock a few years later when we find out who turned out to take Jacob. And I should say part of what happened and solved the case is around the 25th anniversary of Jacob's abduction, his mother, Patty Wetterling, who's become a nationally known child safety advocate, went to the sheriff and locals, law enforcement, and said, can you try something else? Can you, basically begging for something? And the sheriff, to his credit, invited the FBI in and some others, and they had a team that specializes in child abductions. And they took a fresh look. And one of the key things that I understand that developed is investigator noticed that there was another young man, a 12-year-old boy, who was abducted 9 months earlier, Jacob Shirel. He escaped. And when the investigator was reading the report from his case, and they've often believed, I should say, that those two were connected. When he was looking at the report, it mentioned the boy's mother said that Jared kept rubbing his sleeve against his face. So they ended up getting the sleeve of his sweatshirt, and they submitted it for DNA testing, and it came back to Danny Heinrich, a guy who's a local guy who never left the area, who'd been looked at initially, one of a bunch of people, but they never got anything. That gave him enough probable cause to go get a search warrant at his house, both on Jacob's case and Jared's. They never found anything to connect him to that, but they found some child porn. They were able to throw the book at him federally on child porn. It was pretty amateur stuff. They threw the book at him. And after all his pretrial appeals faded, he reached out to his attorney and said he wanted to make a deal. And to make a long story short, he said, if they don't charge me with Jacob's case and just the federal stuff, I'll cooperate. They reached a deal with the Wetterling family, and he led them to Jacob's remains and was right just a few miles from where it happened. So that one I've covered others which turned out to be similar, not many. Most of the time it's who you think it is from day one. But that with me, is there somebody else whose name could be in our file? Or could it be, I wrote a piece called None of the Above Once, when people keep asking who you think it was. Because I think we need to keep that lane open. The police we know have focused very heavily and continue to, I believe, on Van Cise, and who knows who else. But I think it's really important that from where we're coming from, that we keep the lane open to none of the above in cases like Jacob's. Keeps me going that way. And I think Scott feels that way.
I agree. Before we answer a couple of questions here, I just wanted to add to that just a little bit. I have seen throughout my career where, in disappearances or murder investigations, whatever the case may be, where police do get tunnel vision. They do. And they just get stuck on one thing, and they fail to kind of look at the big picture. And, we don't really know what all Mason City PD has done with this case because they're very tight-lipped about it. I realize that, but it does make you wonder if that's, not something that's happening here. So I agree with what Caroline just said. It's really important to look out of the box. So, Rachel, we've got some questions.
Yeah. So Lori is asking if she had any boyfriends or ex-boyfriends, if she was dating anyone.
Scott, you want to?
Not in the way you probably think.
Serious boyfriend.
There's no serious boyfriend. There's nobody in Mason City, where Jodi had been for a year and a half at the time that she was abducted, who she was dating, but she dated. We know that there are men who she went on dates with. So I don't know how to answer that, because it's not in the typical case sense of you look at the boyfriend first because there isn't that person. But she did have love interests over the last 18 months in Mason City that have been looked at, I'm sure, by MCPD because we've looked into those as well.
Yeah, she wrote to her friends about some of them, and there's nothing serious that we can see. We looked at that closely. I think she'd hoped to have one at some point because she wanted someday to, beyond her career ambitions, she also hoped to get married and have a family. In high school and college, she dated the same guy for 5-6 years. That was the only serious one that we came across. But believe me, these guys all got looked at. Some of them were polygraphed. So they, you start with, as Snyder can say, most of the time it is somebody you know. So
Yeah.
closely, rightly so, looked at anybody who had any kind of relationship with her back then.
Right.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So-
Go ahead, Rachel.
No, you're fine. So Carrie's wondering if anyone knows how large the river near her apartment is. Was that ever searched or looked at?
Yeah, that river is the Winnebago. It's a pretty major tributary through Mason City. Like every waterway in the Midwest, it fluctuates depending on rainfall upstream over the summer. It had rained, I looked into this once, I want to say like 20 out of the 30 days in June or something like that of 95. So the water level and photo and video of the search efforts initially behind the complex bear this out. There's good cause for them to look at the river initially for a lot of reasons, but nothing, as Scott probably knows, anytime you go looking outside in any nature for a missing person, you're going to find hundreds of things, but they never found anything that was affirmatively linked to Jodi at all. So it's it's a good very first step in the live person search or the search effort for Jodi, because it's really 20 yards from the back of Jodi's apartment complex to the river, which was running pretty high in June of 95, but that never led to anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
And some
Carrie,
other bodies have surfaced over the years. There have been bodies found in that river, but not anything connected to Jodi that we know of.
okay. I'm going to give her PI license now for this channel. She's so good at thinking about all of these little things. She's wondering if the apartments in the complex were rented out. Were all of them rented out? And had there been anyone that came in for a rental showing? Maybe she caught a stranger's eye, and who owned and maintained the apartments? Were they interviewed, and what did they have to say?
The building property manager was interviewed several times by police. The complex itself. So here's the tricky thing about the data we have for the complex at the time in terms of a residential list of who was living there. We have the 1995 Mason City phone book that shows that complex about 85% full. But when did they collect that data? It was sometime in the last 18 months prior to June of 95. So some of the people we found, not many, but a few that are in that phone book along with Jodi, had moved out by June of 1995. So that information in the phone book might be a year old or more. So we don't have an exact roster of who was living there, but a lot of them did live there for long enough where we confirmed they were still living there from whenever the phone book data set was published to June of 1995.
And what the phone book doesn't tell you, and we even interviewed a few people since then who were just, one guy was a boyfriend of a gal there. He doesn't show up on any official record, and he had never been interviewed by police. He tried to see Jodi get ready because he often went to work at 3 a.m, 4 a.m. So he was one. But the police said that they did canvass the building and talked to everybody. And we talked to some people who were interviewed and said, just they didn't feel they were that thoroughly interviewed. Some felt they were more thoroughly interviewed than others. But, we don't know if there could be some handyman who was working on a project who doesn't show up on the official cleaners roster.
And if you look at, there's a Mason City Globe Gazette photo of MCPD processing the scene on the morning of June 27th. And in the background, you can see a half painted white fence. So it's just part of maintenance upkeep of any apartment complex. Could be a radiator guy, could be a roofer, could be someone who's painting the fence, which is impossible at this point, especially to track down exactly who was there painting that fence on that day, unless they themselves put themselves there.
Wow.
Interesting. So there's a road I want to go down if you guys are comfortable going down. And again, I don't want to put you guys in a position where you're not comfortable going down a certain road, but I think you'll be okay with this. It's part of the 27 pieces, the podcast, the 27 facts about the Jodi case. And for those of you who haven't seen that podcast, all the podcasts are excellent. They're all done by Scott and Caroline primarily.
Very good.
But the 27 pieces on the Find Jodi website really outlines the case very well. And so one of the parts of the 27 piece, Scott and Caroline, talks about the journal that Jodi had written.
Yeah.
And so
That's
whichever one
wild
of
to
you
me.
wants to, yeah, it's wild to me too. And ultimately the journal ended up in places where it was kind of not expected. So talk about whatever you want to talk about there, if at all.
We know the origin of the journal as one of the several police chiefs that MCP has had since 95 was retiring. So for one way or another, a photocopy of that left his office and was mailed to the newspaper by his wife, again, after he'd left. It didn't take the current administration at that time very long at all to figure out who had sent it, where it had been sent from, and that eventuated in no charges for her. Caroline has reached out to that woman kind of recently in the last few years, and she's not willing to talk about any motivations or what she was trying to get at by mailing it to the newspaper. She was a former employee of that newspaper, but there we get into speculation. That the journal in full, we assume, was sent to the newspaper. They made the editorial decision to only publish about 6 or 8 real excerpts from that, which focus mostly on the week or so before she disappeared. There is some in there that gives some kind of a general mindset of hers. But I don't think the pieces that were published are, I've never considered them to be insightful into the person that Jodi was. It's just a snapshot of 6 or 8 photos of basically of her life. But that is one of the crazy rabbit holes of the case, because that again is something that doesn't happen often in cold cases.
Not at all.
It was very bizarre. I mean, I've seen a lot of strange things, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Cheryl Ellingson, the woman who mailed the thing, is just try to see if she'd give me some sense of why. It doesn't make their primary person of interest they were looking at look bad. I mean, the stuff that's published, Jodi writes pretty extensively about her last, until a couple of days before she disappears, describes this water skiing weekend with John Van Sice, her friend Annie Cruz, Tammy Baker, and a couple others, and they were staying in Iowa City, and it just sounded like a fun weekend. There were no hints of, I'm trying to pull away from this or anything bothering me. But what was it just to give a break to somebody? Was she upset with how her husband was treated? I'm curious what motivated her. We don't know. And she basically hung up the phone on me when I called and was appalled that I got her number. But I would like to have gotten some insight. That was one of several strange things. And another one was, or unusual in terms of evidence, a copy of the birthday video was wound up in Oxygen. There's 17 and a half minute birthday video wound up on the Oxygen show 4 or 5 years ago. And again, this is something that's in evidence, and different things like that have gotten out. And I know that we've heard in recent years, some investigators feel way too much information's gotten out, but beyond those, I don't know what it is. I wish we knew specifically what they are concerned about, but it's been unusual. And I don't think it's helped people's confidence in them. If you think something like a journal is going to be mailed to the newspaper, or a birthday evidence gets out that way, I don't think that really makes some people as inclined to come forward if they do something like that. Maybe you can address that, Scott Snyder, from your work. I mean, if something like that happened in a case you were working on.
Yes. I mean, I've had cases like that where people are just not willing to come forward for whatever reason. I'm sorry, Caroline. I was looking at a couple of the comments here and missed part of what you said, but are you asking me specifically about why people won't?
Well, if it's something like that happened, a case you were working on, just where would you put something like that as an investigator, or something like a journal got released, and how harmful are things like that in terms of keeping up the connection with the community and their confidence in how the investigation is being handled?
I think it can be certainly very, very damaging. I mean, it brings in a lot of questions, obviously, on, first of all, what's the motivation for releasing that journal to begin with? And I think what it does too is it probably, without really knowing, why, what the motivation is, it leads to a lot of speculation too. And, that can certainly, speculation, as we all know, can certainly muddy up cases in a major way. Especially now more so than ever with social media, but speculation is never really good. And so I've had cases like that where that's happened before. And you just kind of have to deal with it. I mean, there's no other way to put it, but yeah, I guess that would be my short answer on that.
One thing I wanted to mention in terms of stuff we work on is we probably, correct me Scott if I'm wrong, probably 95% of the various leads we chase, and some of them seem promising, some are rabbit holes right away, but you'll never see on our site. We do it internally, and we share some things occasionally we have in the podcast, but our feeling is we're not going to put it all out there. And there are people that feel we should put more out there, but we feel like any investigation, we don't want to contaminate the main one, the finding authority, and we just don't see a value down the road. If the case is solved, there may be some things we would share, but we pretty much do a lot of behind the scenes stuff that we don't showcase, and we'll give occasional windows to show what we're working on, or if we think maybe we had a case last year, it was very interesting. A woman came forward after a podcast, and she didn't know a whole lot about what was going on, but she was curious. She said a man had approached her. He had been standing behind Jodi's building. This happened a month, 5 weeks before Jodi disappeared. She was about 14, running home from school. This guy behind Jodi's building called out to her. She was scared. She ran up to Kentucky, ran home, made a report. We had never heard that before. We never heard it when Jodi went missing. You would think it's something that they would have maybe put out publicly. And as far as we know, no one in the building was informed that there was some guy acting strangely. And is it connected? We have no indication it was, but it was really, we felt it was something that people should at least hear. Maybe it would jog someone else's memory. And the guy was never caught, but that came from a podcast because she wondered if the guy who was chasing her might be Tom Korskaden. And she saw a picture. No, it's not the guy, but she's way out in the East Coast. And it just shows you the power of things like a podcast like this, where maybe there's somebody who used to live in Mason City as she did, who had something to share. And I said, I wish I'd known about this 30 years ago. I would have made sure it got a lot of coverage and attention. And I bet I wish Jodi had known about some guy hanging out behind her building, which doesn't sound like it really fits likely who took her, but who knows?
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Carrie had another question. This is kind of related as far as, tracking things over the years. So if people been followed up with who lived in the apartment complex over the years, so like if any of them ended up picking up criminal charges later that were similar to what happened to Jodi.
Scott, you want to?
Yeah, I think if you take a cross section of 80 people, 20 years from now, a percentage are going to have picked up criminal charges unrelated to, a specific event that happened to Jodi. I know initially pretty much everybody in the complex was canvassed by MCPD. I know the FBI followed up with a number of people that we talked to within 6 or 9 months of that. I don't know of anyone that was followed up on in terms of just knock on the door, interview you. What do you remember from that night since then? But I can also say, without getting into specifics, that nobody in the complex who would be interesting to a law enforcement professional, investigator, some of those people were looked into a little bit deeper. So one of the challenges of apartment living is you're next to so many strangers day and night. Right. But we can think, Scott, you can think, Caroline, I'm sure, of a half dozen cases off the top of our head of women specifically kind of in Jodi's demographic who end up being assaulted or murdered by somebody who encounters them first at the apartment complex. So right. I know that's something that was looked into.
And as I said earlier, what we can't measure are those that might have been coming and going who are not on an official roster and who might have been an acquaintance of somebody. And a couple residents we found with some criminal stuff, but nothing that we're aware of in depth of any kind of criminal right. sexual conduct. But that doesn't mean there wasn't somebody visiting or staying with somebody, but nobody and we've reached out in our course of following up, trying to track down residents. We've done Google search and backgrounds and a lot looking for that kind of thing. See if there's somebody suddenly, say in California, who did something 10 years later or whatever along those lines.
Yeah. Right. Interesting. One of the questions I wanted to ask the two of you and whoever wants to talk about this, or you don't have to at all if you don't want to, The morning or a couple of mornings prior to Jodi being taken, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a jogger, a woman
Right.
jogging along in front of the parking lot that saw some stuff that was kind of interesting. Is that something that you guys want to go down that road right now, or?
Scott, I've not investigated that angle on it, but I know it's been looked at.
Yeah, there was a jogger, yeah, as you said, Scott, about 4 or 5 days before. It was, I believe, the
Right.
week prior, who was running north along Kentucky. And as we described the parking lot of that parking lot of the complex earlier, it's an oval and it's a one-way. And she reports seeing basically a vehicle speeding out of the parking lot at about 4 o'clock in the morning, just way too fast for somebody just exiting the parking lot. And it freaked her out and scared her. And that, in hindsight, you're probably not going to link that to something that's going to happen the following week. But looking back, it's about the same time of day. I'm a believer that Jodi was stalked. I don't know how, in her case, we define stalked, but an interesting question is, for how many nights was the perpetrator or perpetrators parked in her parking lot, or there are areas of Kentucky on the street where you can actually see her window as well, to kind of get a feel for her routines and patterns. So yeah, it's definitely something interesting. The lead that we came up with, that Caroline just talked about, behind Building C a couple of years ago, very interesting. One of the things, just to play devil's advocate on all that I found fascinating, is it's amazing to me, as you look in the half-mile radius around the key apartments, how many bad guys there were just at that one time. And they can't all be the abductors of Jodi, if any of them are. But again, that game of Clue I was referencing, where we have options A, B, and C, there are a lot of bad people living in that part of Mason City, and probably parts of every town that size.
Sure.
That just probably won't get looked into because there are just so many of them.
Well, one of the things going on that's come up from time to time, but nothing's ever been connected to Jodi, is there's Dustin Honkin, a person who was involved in murdering 5 people, a big drug deal. All of that was going on while Jodi was there. And there was some speculation that maybe Jodi was investigating him, etc. Well, he wasn't on the radar of the media at the time. It turns out he murdered 5 people, and the bodies hadn't been discovered till later. But just in a town of 28,000 people, just amazed at some of the really bad people who are living there at the time. And as Scott said, they can't all be involved, but you have to look at them. You look at who's capable, then motive. And some people ask, why that morning? Why would he do it there? That was the one place you could be sure to find Jodi. You couldn't be sure where she'd be after work, but you knew, given what schedule was, what time she was on the air, you could kind of, within some reasonable certainty, pinpoint, if she lived here, what the window would be when she'd have to go to work. And probably better to try to grab her there, frankly, than at work.
And I like that as a profile point of Jodi's abductor, that this person must have decided is the easiest access that he has to her, which tells you he can't get inside her apartment complex. He can't get her alone in social situations. That's speculation on my part, but as Gary Peterson, who was a co-founder of Find Jodi, and as Caroline mentioned, since passed away, that was a big question he would ask over and over again. Why there? Why then? And I think that's a important one when you're trying to narrow down from, there's 500,000 people in that media market, who we might be looking for, what type of person.
Yeah. Laura Quigley just made an interesting comment here that I'm just going to show, and I was going to talk about this anyway, because I'm a firm believer, as you are, Scott, that Jodi was stalked. When you look at the whole picture, and you look at the fact that, from the parking lot, from across the street, you can see right up into her apartment, the fact that she was in the phone book. And the other piece that I wanted to just mention, and you guys don't have to go there if you don't want to, but it's my understanding that there was a nearby dumpster to the parking lot. And I guess there were a number of beer cans that were found around that dumpster area that I found to be very interesting. That kind of made me wonder if, was somebody really there at that dumpster working up the nerve, having some beers and getting the nerve to actually do what they ultimately did do.
we did a whole episode almost entirely on beer cans. So this is kind of a rabbit hole. There were beer cans. It's now been confirmed very recently by MCPD. There were a couple of beer cans in her apartment. So that's one set of beer cans that people talk about. There were also beer cans found by different people. They were seen sort of at different times in the other 2 parking lots in that apartment complex, including Jodi's. The one, Scott, I think that you're referencing, these beer cans were stocked on the parking, not sure what the technical term is, but
on the curb in the parking lot.
On the curb.
Okay.
And sometime in the week or so prior to, and then they went missing. So somebody for some reason spending time in the parking lot and drinking beer in the meantime. Anything beyond that is kind of speculation. The reason I think she was stalked is just having been to the scene itself. It's not enough to be waiting for Jodi in the parking lot. This person, I strongly believe Jodi was attacked from behind because of how the key was slightly bent.
Yes.
And Jodi had 12 steps to put her key in the driver's side door of the Miata, and then the force of the hit from behind bent the key slightly. To do that, you have to very intentionally put yourself in that place where, as Jodi's walking toward her car, to her left is a dumpster, and behind her, out of eye line of her. So unless she happened to turn her head to the left at that moment as she was exiting her apartment door, the door to the complex, she would not have been able to see this person. So you have to, I believe, either be familiar with the complex or have sat there on nights previous or for a long time that night before to develop this plan, wait for the light to go out, put yourself in position by the dumpster, and then attack Jodi from behind as she's trying to get into her car.
Yeah. Total blitz attack. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, along those lines, I think we mentioned the team of former FBI profilers looked at this case last fall and did an episode, and they very much felt that the scene screamed that kind of stalker blitz attacker. The stuff that you see at the scene, that's what was talking to them, the way the evidence was there, versus saying somebody she knew. And that's just, again, their most likely scenario. Someone she knew, would there have been more of a confrontation? Would there have been, why there? Would that be more of a risk to be in a place where you might be recognized? But it's all really speculation, but the scene seems to scream more a stalker. Or could she have been stalked and that's a parallel things were going on? Maybe there was a stalker going on and it's not the same person that took her. It's something else.
How many stalkers did Jodi have? Is October of 94 with a truck one and then somebody else ends up attacking her? Are they the same person?
Yeah. Who was following her in March that made her feel that she needed to take this safety class?
Right. Yeah. Well, in that line of work, I mean, Caroline, you were in that line of work. You know, it certainly does breed people that, like to follow. They develop an unhealthy obsession, and they do follow those personalities around. And so I think you're right. I think it could clearly be maybe there was more than one person. Maybe the person that was stalking her in that situation or following her in that situation is not the same person. So, we just don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Do we have any other questions, Rachel, that we need to address?
I think I answered it, but we have some people asking if her parents are still living. I believe they are deceased, but her sister is living, correct?
She's 2 sisters, actually. Her Jodi's mom died about 10 years ago without knowing the answers. Her father died when she was, I believe, 13. So both parents are gone, but she has a sister, Joanne, who still lives in Minnesota, and where Jodi grew up. And then she has another sister that lives elsewhere. She has a niece she was very close to. So a fairly small family. As I said earlier, she grew up in a small town. Her first job out of college, which doesn't get a lot of attention, she actually was a flight attendant for about a year. Did a lot of international travel, flew to Japan, and then she decided to, she said one point she decided she wanted to be on the air, not in the air. And so she went to Cedar Rapids for, I think it was about a year, Scott, and then she went to Minnesota, moved a typical path. Then she went to Alexandria, Minnesota. About a year and a half into her contract in Mason City, had applied for jobs in the Twin Cities and was looking beyond. I remember I interviewed a former news director at KARE 11 in Minneapolis who said that she had actually talked to Jodi, who had sent her an audition tape reel, and that same audition reel a couple months later was used, the video, and it was used to cover the story of Jodi disappearing. It's a very sad twist, but she was clearly on a track. She wanted maybe to do the Today Show someday. She loved Paulazon, Kathy Lee Gifford, but she had everything ahead of her. And I think that's the thing we try to make sure that doesn't get lost in the horrific thing that happened to her. Is she would be 56. She was born in 1969. She should be having her children and still probably very much in her career. And what her family wants is, they don't expect, she was declared dead legally in 2001. They don't expect Jodi to come walking through any doors or be alive, but they want to say goodbye to her. They want to do something in Long Prairie where she grew up and have the answers. And one of the things I learned from the Wetterling case is, as horrific as the ending was, Patty Wetterling will tell you it's better to know. It's better to know than to keep waiting for someone to knock on the door and just maybe come home. And that's why we hope to keep going. We've had a billboard up in Mason City since her 50th birthday in 2018. I heard someone on the radio the other day saying billboards and flyers don't make a difference. I don't know if they do, but we want Jodi to be visible in Mason City. It's as much symbolic until she's found. And if there's somebody there that knows something, or somebody who is responsible, I want her face to be staring down at them and, making them uncomfortable and be visible.
So before we close out, let's talk about that. So if someone who watches this in the future or is watching tonight may have some information, so how can they best get that information across to the proper authorities, Scott and Caroline?
We have at findjodi.com at the bottom of all of our posts, contact numbers for the MCPD, also an Iowa DCI agent. His email is there. He's handling the case statewide right now. We've encountered a lot just because Mason City Police has a checkered history with the community. I think administrations in the last 10 years have done their very best to try to fix that. But there was a lot going on before Jodi went missing in Mason City when it comes to their relationship with their police department. So what we get more than anything is, I don't want to reach out to the police, or I did reach out and I was blown off as their perception. So our constant drumbeat is, even if you've told somebody, even if you think it's nothing, don't be afraid to bother us. Don't be afraid to bother the police. They have a whole relatively small department with a whole city to enforce. So, be bothersome, be persistent if you think it's important. And for anyone that may watch this or listen to this that doesn't know or think they have any information, look around to the people in your life. If you know they have a connection to Mason City, ask them about Jodi Huisentruit, because this is one of those JFK kind of cases locally in Mason City where everybody who lived there at the time remembers hearing about it on the radio or seeing the new newscast on her station where she hadn't shown up yet. It's an indelible memory. And you never know what that person might say next after they say, yeah, I remember it. And I also heard this story about, you never know. You might be that link. Even if you've never been to Iowa in your life and you weren't born in 1995, you might be able to bring something to someone that can lead to who knows where the dominoes might fall. And Caroline mentioned the lack of forensic evidence in this case, which is how cases like this, as old as 50 plus years old, are being solved now with familial DNA and the like. This case is going to be solved or resolved somehow, if it is, by somebody saying something and somebody encountering some piece of information. So absolutely, reach out to Find Jodi anonymously, reach out to the police, reach out to DCI, tell somebody what you think you know, even if you think it's probably nothing.
Perfect. You guys, I think we'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I will post in the show notes a little later tonight all the information on where you can reach out, the website. And I encourage you to listen to the podcast too. We will do a part 2, but in the meantime, you can kind of catch up. And Carrie, we need more questions. I need your creative, detail-oriented mind to come to think of some more things. So
and we so appreciate you're doing this and helping to keep Jodi visible, because this is how it's going to work. It's how it's going to get solved.
I mean, the dedication that you guys have to this is amazing, and time well spent, and hopefully rewards for you and in another life as well. I'm just listening to your podcast. I was just floored by just your dedication to this. And I can imagine if I had a family member that was missing and I had the two of you and your team,
thank you,
keeping this alive the way that you are. I mean, how incredibly meaningful that is. So, I mean, you guys are making a huge difference in people's lives with this. So
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Get some answers. It's very humbling and very frustrating at times to go this many
Well,
years
yeah.
not have an answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Scott, Caroline, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone who watched this. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe, you guys. That really does help the algorithms. We always forget to say that.
I know we always forget.
We do. But again, Scott, Caroline, we really greatly appreciate you guys doing this, and we'll definitely have you back on again when we can make this happen.
Thank you.
Great.
For sure.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you, guys.
All right, viewers, we'll see you soon.
See
Bye-bye.
you soon, guys. And